Which ranged physical is the hardest to play in Final Fantasy XIV Dawntrail? Is there a ranking here, or are they all equally simple and it doesn't matter? Well, I ran some polls to gather some data, with results ranging from 7,000 to 10,000 votes, which definitely shows some interesting information. So, what does the community of Final Fantasy XIV, or at least the ones we can poll here, think is the hardest ranged physical job? For the longer version of the poll explanation, check the hardest tank video, link in the description. The way the polls are done is that we compare two jobs in pairs until every combination of jobs have been compared, and from this information we can get a ranking of what's harder than what. The question being polled is as simple as, what is the hardest job in your opinion? And welcome to the internet, we simply have to account for the fact that someone might vote based on casual content, hard content, leveling experience, max level experience, difficulty of optimization, or just for the lols. So let's talk about some of the things that can make a job easy or hard, and get to the ranking of ranged physicals. Dead last, Dancer. Interestingly, compared to polls of any other role, Dancer got more votes in its polls, relatively speaking, compared to any other dead last job, getting 12% and 29% respectively. So the opinion of how easy Dancer is not as totally unanimous as one might think. In a way, Dancer sort of represents a slightly simpler quote-unquote take on the same kind of challenges that Bard deals with, which I believe is also reflected in the votes. Strangely, Dancer also has something in common with Machinist, just much less so. But with that, what makes Dancer easy? For a start, between the ranged physicals, Dancer has by far the least amount of cooldowns to keep track of offensively. This is further emphasized by the fact that the cooldowns sort of compound into each other. Standard step every 30 seconds, flourish every 60 seconds, technical finish and devilment every 2 minutes. The rest is resource management and reacting to procs and randomness. Defensively, Dancer also has a slight advantage over the others, as both Curing Vaults and Improvisation heavily emphasize more of a reactive approach, and as a DPS, where you often feel less incentivized to proactively deal with mechanics, it feels a lot easier to handle simply using your options to recover after something goes sideways instead of in advance. In essence, some big heavy hitters in terms of ease of use. There's also a bit of perceived ease in that a large part of Dancer's performance comes from buffing someone else, meaning less weight on the Dancer's own shoulders to perform. But this ain't all a dance on roses, as we say in Denmark, so let's move on to what makes Dancer hard. A slight challenge to begin is that Dancer starts at level 60 with quite a lot of toolkit already filled in, which can make it a bit overwhelming, but perhaps less so than other jobs starting at a high level. Standard and technical finish are somewhat unintuitive attacks, where standard finish doesn't lead very clearly with how much damage it does, leading some new dancers to believe it is meant to be used exactly to maintain the damage buff, despite the attack itself being very solid. The logic of this misunderstanding being that the cooldown is perhaps just short to give you room to reapply as needed. Technical finish, on the other hand, being a bigger cooldown with a bigger damage number, can lead new dancers to believe that devilment should be used on boosting that, when optimally you use devilment after technical finish, such that both buffs overlap for longer. I'm sure there will be some comments asking about this anyway. Essentially, devilment is going to be more valuable to your dance partner than you, and technical finishes damage, once we account for the fact it takes as long as 3 regular GCDs to perform, is actually kinda mid, due to the fact that standard finishes cooldown is fixed, and that you want to use it every 30 seconds, preferably on the dot. Dancer is also on a growing list of jobs that hate speed in general, as having just a bit of it makes standard step align weirdly with the GCD. Then you either let it drift by 1 every 30 seconds, or you lose out on any value speed could have gained you by effectively waiting the time gained until standard step is ready. This is also sort of where Dancer meets with Machinist in difficulty, quote-unquote, as they both have this aversion to speed where it completely messes with their flow. Due to the fact that Savage Raiders and beyond tend to have enough choice and gear to completely avoid speed if they so desire, this problem is mainly felt outside of that. During leveling, among more casual players that simply have less gearing options. Due to the way Dancer's steps work, it is also more heavily impacted by higher latencies. And while only having a few cooldowns in its arsenal, any of them drifting just a bit can feel catastrophic when trying to keep a coherent burst sequence during more intense boss mechanics. The fact that Dancer generates a ton of esprit during its burst also means that Dancer may well have one of the most unpredictable bursts in the game, although some might say this is more a case of my steak is too juicy and my lobster is too buttery. When it comes to randomness, Dancer is probably, among the ranged physicals, if not all jobs in general, the one that most directly has to deal with its randomness. Doing Simon Says puzzles for standard and technical step, and reacting to 1, 2, 3, 4 combo procs and follow-up procs on its feather spending. These can mean that where most jobs can just follow a strict sequence and keep their eyes on the fight, a Dancer may need to glance at their state in between a lot more, because there simply is no way to know for sure what they need to press next in the moment. It being attached to the GCD and not always requiring immediate attention in the case of feathers and fillers does help a bit though. Between the three ranged physicals, Dancer relies on attacks with the shortest range between them for single target damage, with the dance finishes peaking at 15 yalms, which is a decent chunk, but not 25 yalms, which is often the norm for ranged attacks. And finally, albeit a smaller factor in terms of actual gameplay difficulty, because Dance Partner must be given to someone, there is a level of needing to understand how other jobs play to make the most of this effect. Middle of the pack. Machinist. The only ranged physical with no randomness in its rotation itself, and so, for some reason, having some whack optimization when it comes to perfect rotations, including deliberately overcapping on heat, just to make things absolutely perfect. Now, whether this stuff is needed or not is a whole conversation of its own, but whether an individual views this level of perfectionism as required or not probably heavily impacts how hard Machinist would be considered to be. A particular oddity about Machinist is also the fact that it is in a role category that is known for damage increasing raid buffs, but provide none of its own, which means that it, for some reason, has to perform a lot better to justify its position over a Dancer or a Bard, despite being fine. But what makes Machinist easy? Between the range jobs, Machinist is the only one without a raid buff, or even a strict burst window when it comes to freestyling. As long as cooldowns are being used as they come up, you are reasonably free to do whatever you want, and thanks to Barrel Stabilize and Wildfire naturally lining up with each other, you don't even need to make sure you have a hypercharge for that. Because the biggest part of the Machinist burst being distinctly less than 20 seconds, also makes it a bit more flexible in a situation where raid buffs are less predictable, if desired. Drill having charges and Excavator having a ready timer also means both of these can be more flexible to align with whoever wants to buff the Machinist. And as long as you have at least 50 battery, you can always send whatever robot you can afford when buffs are offered to begin with. This all combines to allow Machinists a very free and flexible rotation in any content where absolute perfection isn't required, which applies to nearly all content at present as far as I know. Yes, even Savage. Essentially, the intuitive way to play Machinist should be pretty approachable, despite having a lot of things you need to track and a lot of things you can do, because several of those things leave room for you to address it when you can, without too big of a loss. That being said, what makes Machinist hard? Starting with the defensive stuff, while Machinist's Dismantle is probably the most impactful extra option among the three jobs, it being only 10 seconds means it is stricter, and it being proactive also requires paying closer attention for it to actually be useful, compared to what Dancer has. When it comes to resources, making the most of the battery gauge requires a lot of planning ahead, since optimally you want to have a 100 battery queen when raid buffs are happening, although this is mostly important for high-end content. For more casual content, the awkward part about battery gauge is that you can only spend it on what is effectively a single target attack. This also expands to Wildfire, which is a 2-minute cooldown you probably want to use when it is available, but in dungeons where a large part of the fighting is AoE, who do you put it on? And do you then use Auto Crossbow or Blazing Shot? Speaking of which, the insanely wacky potency differences between these two spenders making Machinist incredibly weird when it comes to AoE. If you have ever looked over the rotation priority on different target counts for jobs, Machinist has some of the craziest stuff, where you need to account for how many enemies are there, how many OGSD's attacks you already have available in the moment potentially if they won't live long, and how well stacked the enemies are to determine which of these high-paced GZDs to use. The high pace also causes problems for higher latency players while we're at it. Continuing on AoE, Machinist's Flamethrower doing good damage now is all well and good, but then introduces a challenge in placing yourself right, since it essentially requires you to not move at all for up to 10 seconds. Optimally, you also need to make sure you don't have any other cooldowns that need addressing in those 10 seconds. When it comes to Machinist's tools, Drill, Air Anchor, Bioblaster, Chainsaw, all of them being on reasonably strict timers, with Drill and Bioblaster having charges making them more flexible, means that not using them on time can drift them and mess with your rotation for the rest of the fight, just because you were late once. This combined with Hypercharge effectively requiring you to think 7.5 seconds ahead each time gives Machinist plenty of opportunities to mess up, with a punishment that is felt enough as long as the player pays attention to cooldowns to this degree. Relative to Dancer, Machinist feels more punishing for mistakes, and may feel stricter once you know what needs to happen. And for the more casual player, feels more high pace, as while Dancer can stall for a second if you aren't sure which dance step to press, comes with practice, don't worry about it. Machinist doesn't really have the space for that in its hypercharges. Relative to Bard, Machinist has a lot less randomness involved, 0% randomness, which makes it feel a lot easier to maneuver simply because you can perfect the fully predictable rotation it has, which of course leads us to the hardest ranged physical, Bard. Dot management, song management, many random procs with short reaction windows, several cooldowns that expect to be addressed immediately at various different timings. It sort of combines the hardships of both Machinist and Dancer, and then sprinkles a little extra on top called dot management. Due to things like Iron Jaws, Bard also has the strongest case of being punished hard for making a small mistake or oversight. So, with that being said, what makes Bard easy? Relative to the two other jobs, Bard is the only one that can be picked up from the very start at level 1. The fact Machinist starts with a pretty basic toolkit at 30 makes this property of Bard less significant, but is worth mentioning nonetheless. Among the three, Bard and Dancer sort of takes turns on this depending on balance, but the amount of damage Bard provides through the damage of other party members is quite significant and can somewhat compensate for worse play, as long as the raid buffs go out on time. While not exactly something that makes the job easier, Bard being the only job that can deal with removable debuffs aside from healers makes it a lot more capable of handling some of the fallout of making mistakes in the first place. But that is pretty much where the story ends, and admittedly, the easy points for Bard are pretty weak, so what makes Bard hard? In Dawntrail, Bard is essentially the only job remaining that has a proper interaction with its dots once they have been applied. Said interaction being the ability to reapply them for cheaper by refreshing them with Iron Jaws. Granted, the punishment for messing this up is actually a lot less than it might seem, adding up to 70 potency plus any potential dot ticks missed, while feeling like losing a whole GZD or more. Due to the presence of Iron Jaws in the toolkit, alongside a significant amount of damage buffs, Bard also much more prominently features dot snapshotting, the act of reapplying your dots during raid buffs to apply the dot with increased power for its full duration. This means that while Bard is among a selection of jobs that have dots, which already adds complexity to the job that jobs that don't have dots avoid, Bard has extra emphasis on the timing of said dot application, and if the timing is missed, takes longer than usual to fix it, making the punishment for error extra severe. Speaking of dot snapshotting, Bart's 2-minute burst is very dense and chaotic, with a lot of both GZD and OGZ things to work through, while simultaneously dealing with the random timing of repertoire procs to make sure pitch perfect goes out on time. Sometimes the exact timing of apex arrow and so blast arrow can shift simply due to when you hit 80 or more soul voice gauge, if you are somehow exceptionally unlucky with procs. And, while the average amount of soul voice gauge should mean that you do get one apex arrow with 80 or more gauge every 60 seconds or so, it can vary, and it can sometimes vary heavily, meaning that even if you can use options like Sidewinder to track this 1-minute clock, you kinda need to keep an eye on the gauge itself to be sure. And to further expand on the chaotic randomness, while Bart runs on a normal GZD most of the time, Repertoire runs on a 3-second clock that resets every time you switch song, meaning optimally you have to make sure you switch song as close to that 3-second clock ticking as you can while still possibly needing to react to what the result of said tick is. Especially in particular with Wanderer's Minuet, where you may or may not need to use pitch perfect before switching tunes. Both Mage's Ballad and Army's Paean are much more relaxed, with Mage's Ballad possibly being able to tick 3 or 4 times before you have to respond to it, and Army's Paean's proc sort of just falling in with the tapestry as it goes. But that doesn't change how heavily punishing it is to miss the timing on a song change, as you don't have that much leeway, and once you break it, it is almost always too costly to fix. When it comes to Wanderer's Minuet, due to how Imperial Arrow gives you extra repertoire procs while Pitch Perfect wants to be fired off on 3 stacks, means that you can frequently, regularly, run into a risk crossroads of, if I use Imperial Arrow to hit 3 stacks, can I use Pitch Perfect before the next talk on the song? Or should I fire Pitch first and then Imperial Arrow so I don't lose a stack and don't risk anything? And this has to happen with less than 2 seconds to make the decision, and can take place during your burst too. Another example of this type of crossroads comes with Hawk's Eye, the proc that enables Refulgent Arrow. Since basically all of your filler shots can proc it, waiting until the very last moment to reapply your dots could mean you proc Hawk's Eye right then, and then don't have time to spend it before Iron Jaws. And then Iron Jaws also procs Hawk's Eye, meaning you lost out on damage. Granted, it is ultimately just 60 potency, but this adds up over time. Compared to Dancer, while Bart has its randomness slightly, very slightly more spread out than Dancer, it is a constant throughout the rotation that often requires immediate attention, where Dancer can often wait 1 or more GZDs to address it, and addressing said randomness often comes naturally. I got a proc giving me a better filler GZD, compared to Bart, that intermingles the basic filler with dot management. Yes, you may have gotten a proc making your next filler better, but now Iron Jaws asks for attention instead. Procs and OGZDs Bart has to address are also often unrelated to each other, whereas Dancer's procs are usually connected. Repertoire procs versus Dancer feathers. Although, Dancer does have the issue with dealing with Esprit at times. The fact Bart has a period of its rotation where its GZD goes faster with Army's Paean also means that the exact alignment of certain OGZDs, Imperial Arrow comes to mind, may feel weirdly skewed and inconsistent, that further add to the chaos. And finally, Nature's Min, Bart's extra party defensive, is by far the most complicated to use out of the 3 jobs, boosting healing, meaning it does nothing beyond boosting second wind without someone else's intervention and assistance. But with all that said, which ranged physical do you find the hardest? There can be many reasons depending on what you focus on. For example, a perfectionist might prefer Machinist due to its predictability, while a more relaxed, go-with-the-flow kind of player might prefer the total chaos of Bart. Someone focused on simpler consistency might also choose Dancer for harder content, simply because it is perhaps a bit less intense than the other 2 when it comes to precision and reaction. An interesting thing when it comes to the voting that I wanted to highlight is that despite how much harder Bard is often considered compared to the other two, Machinist got a decent amount of votes in that comparison, which I assume might at least partly originate from either the perception that Machinist is too weak, and indeed if you're playing a weaker job, you have to work harder to perform just as well, which in turn does make the job harder by extension. Another possible factor is the fact that Machinist's optimal rotation is extremely strict, so much so that it could be argued that just performing it is harder than playing Bard or Dancer, even when you have mastered it. However, based on some Machinist data, you can perform well beyond good enough without doing this super perfection. So if you have heard this stuff and it has scared you away from trying Machinist, don't worry and give it a shot. There's also a possibility that the fact Machinist does not provide any rate buffs makes it more selfish, means more responsibility on its shoulders to perform, making it appear harder than Bard to some players as a result. I also find it interesting that, despite how unanimously Dancers considered the easy option and Bard the hard option, the voting was significantly less in agreement than for the tank and healer polls. Anyway, do let me know your opinions in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi. Links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, partly due to all the dot buffs healers got throughout Dawntrail, even the weakest dot, Astrologian's Combustion, is roughly equal in power to the combined dot damage of both of Bard's dots, with Raging Strikes on top. Of course, there's a matter of relative power, and Bard is more about many small hits. The combined power of these dots add up to roughly the same damage as Apex Arrow after all.